Every time I went to Disneyland, I made sure of getting on Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Growing up, I adored the adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. The film was always entertaining to me. I loved both the story of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. However, the manic energy and insanity of Mr. Toad won me over, and I always preferred Mr. Toad over the Ichabod story. The ride at Disneyland echoed the manic energy of the film and the titular character, Mr. Toad. Today we are kicking off a series on Parks and Popcorn where we will be reviewing films based on theme park rides and attractions. This series is called From Parks to Movies, and our first installment revolves around The Wind in the Willows from 1993, which was later titled Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Now, each episode in this series will be constructed in 4 parts. The background information on the ride paired with a summary of the ride will be part 1 of each video. Part 2 of each video will be the background information on the film. Part 3 will be a detailed review of the film. And part 4 will be comparing the film to the ride itself to see if it's actually a faithful adaptation. Let's begin. Now, unlike a lot of the other films that we will be covering, we actually need to cover a part 0 for this video, because we need to cover the source material of the ride and its many filmed adaptations that we will be discussing today and referring to, before we actually get to dive into the ride or the film itself. Now, today's episode does revolve around The Wind in the Willows, a children's story published in 1908. The author, Kenneth Grahame, wrote a story about mole, rat, badger, and toad. Toad is the eccentric one who causes all the trouble. Nonetheless, these 4 are friends. The story is set in England and focuses on themes such as friendship and the contrast between living a simple life and then a modern obsession life. Toad is obsessed with motor cars, and this leads him down a quite terrible path as he gets himself into a lot of trouble after he decides to drive them recklessly. Mole, rat, and badger place their dear friend Toad under house arrest to stop him from harming himself and others, since the crashes keep happening and Toad's expenses are rising. Toad escapes house arrest and finds himself at Red Lion Inn as he steals a red motor car parked out front. Toad recklessly drives and is caught by the police and imprisoned for 20 years. Now, while Toad escaped, his friends stayed at Toad Hall awaiting his return until the weasels and other creatures from the Wild Wood came in and took over the hall. Toad escapes jail and the gang reunite to take back their home, and they all live happily ever after as Toad apologizes and changes his ways. Now, that is a very rough summary of the book, leaving out a lot of crucial details. I also do have to mention that in the novel, there are side stories going on that are in between the main story parts. Some of these side stories would include Mole and Rat meeting the sun god Pan. Now, the book was hard to publish at first as many rejected the original manuscript, but when it was published, critics were not big fans. However, audiences loved this book. It got so popular that former US President Theodore Roosevelt wrote to Grahame saying over time that he has accepted these characters as good friends of his. And I think that speaks to the relatability of this book and the sort of comfort of this book. A lot of people really love this book and, the adaptations. And a big part of it is falling in love with those characters, because a big part of this is having a very calm setting and just a very relaxed setting and vibe, despite the manic energy. Now, with that established, let's move on to the background information for the ride. In 1938, Walt Disney bought the adaptation rights to The Wind in the Willows. In 1941, production started. As we all know, this was during World War II. The film was delayed, and in 1949, due to budget issues in a post-World War II era, the film was presented as a package film, showcasing both Mr. Toad and Ichabod. The Mr. Toad portion was supposed to be a full-length feature film all on its own, and I think even the Ichabod, from some sources that I could find, was also supposed to be its own full-length feature film. However, they cut down significantly and they bundled the two together in a much shorter film. In 1955, Disneyland opened, and on Disneyland's opening day, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride was showcased in Fantasyland. The ride has stayed largely the same over all these years. You are in the motorcade and you run through Toad Hall. Then you are out on the streets of London. You then are put on trial for your reckless driving and you are sentenced to jail. As you escape jail, you are run over by a train and you are then condemned to hell. The end. Yes, that is actually the ride, and this ride is insane. No adaptation has actually ended with the entire Toad burning in hell, except for the ride at Disneyland, which is kind of insane. This is still one of the most insane creative choices that I've ever really seen anybody do with anything like this. Like, it's just so out there, but especially for Disney to make, and especially in Disneyland and the parks. But after all these years of this ride being open, 70 plus years of it being open at Disneyland, they have never removed or really sanitized this scene, and I think it's because fans really do appreciate the bizarre obscurity of this ending, and it's kind of like a cult classic ending in a weird way, and people just really enjoy it. One notable aspect of the ride's history is how we almost got an entirely different ride revolving around Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman, or a substitute Mary Poppins ride at the Magic Kingdom in Walt Disney World. Instead, Disney World got Mr. Toad. But as you all know, Mr. Toad is now home to Winnie the Pooh, which we can get to on a different video into that entire subject, because that is a quite interesting subject of how that all went down. Now, over the years, we have gotten multiple adaptations of the classic novel, The Wind in the Willows. The 1983 version actually uses stop-motion animation, which kind of stood out to me. The Disney version is a sort of rushed version and a story condensed to about 40 minutes or so. Nearly every single version of this story is told in animation in one form or another, with the exception of two. In 2006, we got our actual second adaptation of the live-action version of The Wind in the Willows with Bob Hoskins as the Badger. Many of you might know Bob Hoskins from Who Framed Roger Rabbit or from the original Mario movie. But back in 1996, The Wind in the Willows was released for the first time ever as a live-action film, and that is what we are here to talk about today. We are going to review it and dive deep into this film. Terry Jones directed this adaptation of The Wind in the Willows, making it a British comedy adventure as it retold the story of The Wind in the Willows, and it's a trip. It's a trip. I'm not going to lie about that. It's definitely out there. Making all the animal characters into humans with makeup and costumes to convey them as animals was an interesting choice. I do think it works actually, but I know that some people would probably be creeped out by this, but I think a lot of people that really enjoy this film don't even criticize it for this, and I think it honestly does work pretty well. Some people might be put off, but I think the majority are not put off by this. Now, the film was produced by Allied filmmakers, not Disney. Most of the then living Monty Python comedy troupe did participate in the making of this film. And it's almost an honorary Monty Python film, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, you might be wondering how Disney actually got involved and how it's based on Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Both of those are very good questions, but the first one we're going to answer is how it's based on the ride, and the answer to that is it's really not based on the ride. The film is actually based on the book. However, this film was marketed to be based on the ride after it was released. But the Disney film is a faithful enough adaptation of the novel, so it sort of makes sense why Disney could even claim that this film that is, an adaptation of the novel is based on the ride, considering that all three, the ride, this film, and the Disney film, have the same similar plot beats that, don't stray from the novel. So it's easy for Disney to just say, oh, it's based on that ride because now we're distributing it and we can call it Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Now, as for how Disney got involved, Disney came into the very end of this film and took in the distribution rights so they could put it in North American theaters and on home video. However, there was a big contract dispute between Columbia Pictures and Disney, some sort of a lawsuit that resulted in Disney only getting the rights to home video, but this worked for Disney. Disney then changed the name to Mr. Toad's Wild Ride in 1998 to brand it as their own and as an adaptation of the ride. So you might be wondering, what is this film about? How does it hold up? And is it accurate to the ride? Especially given the fact that Disney fought so hard for this film and wanted it to market it that way. Well, let's get into the movie and review it. Now, I already covered the novel and the story of that, so I'm not exactly going to go beat by beat. I will point out some of the story structure, and I kind of glossed over the fact of the Disney film and how that one is, but I'll point out the similarities and the differences here. What I will say though is the film is very faithful to the novel, as I've probably established multiple times for you guys. It combines musical elements and has the animals as human characters with costumes and an entire third act that's very, very different. But, aside from those little elements, it is pretty faithful to the entire novel. And I know I just said the third act is changed slightly in a kind of big way that changes the concept of the film a little bit, but still, despite that, it is a very faithful adaptation of the book, and there's small little details that I think actually are more accurate to the novel than the Disney film itself. But let's get into the film. The film opens with Mole in his home, in a little, molehill down under in his home, and we see the weasels run over his home and destroy it with construction equipment, with massive excavators and tractors and such. Mole then runs to Rat and begs Rat to take him to Toad to see what's going on, because Mole lives on Toad's land. Remember that for later. Now, Mole and Rat head off to Toad Hall, and Toad actually convinces them to go on his caravan for a picnic. They get ran off the side of the road by a motor car, and Toad sees this and starts his insane obsession with motor cars. Toad is a terrible driver, and he really shouldn't be driving at all. However, he starts to sell pieces of his land off to acquire these automobiles, and he already did this in the past. I can't really remember if they touched on that heavily, how the weasels actually acquired the land, because as you'll see later on, the weasels actually owned the land that Mole lived in, and Mole was not aware of that. I don't really remember why he started this in the first place, but I do know that this would then, start to cover up his expenses on the cars and such. Now, the rest of this film is like the novel, but with musical numbers, which, are interesting. I actually enjoyed the musical numbers. I thought it was great. I thought it was fun, but some people might not really be into it. I thought they were fun songs. I thought the Toad songs when he is singing are pretty fun and sometimes hilarious, but let's go further. Now, in the Disney film, Toad is framed in court, while here, Toad is actually guilty. They frame him in the Disney version, which I don't really know why, because that's a pretty big deviation from the actual book itself, maybe to make Toad more like a hero and not a, more selfish kind of guy that you could look at in a bad way. Maybe that's why Disney made him framed instead of actually guilty, but here Toad is guilty just like in the novel. In the Disney film, Toad is rescued, I believe, by his horse friend, but here he escapes because the jailer's daughter has sympathy for Toad and helps him out, which is accurate to the novel. Now, after this, in the Wind in the Willows film that we're focusing on today, Toad, Rat, and Mole actually run from the jail because Rat and Mole were going to the jail to try to get Toad out, but that ended up not happening because Toad escapes because the jailer's daughter, like we just covered. But they all are running, and they end up getting on a train as the police are chasing them. The police get on this train, and the train derails. Now, everybody is actually safe. Toad escapes, though, further, and Rat and Mole are far behind. Rat and Mole are free, as well as Toad is. However, since Toad is so far ahead and kind of incompetent, he's actually captured by the weasels. It is then revealed, as Toad is captured by the weasels, that the weasels wanted all this land to build a dog food factory. Now you might be thinking, what on earth are you saying? Yes, this is the big plot deviation, and this is the part that is a more political commentary. It is a commentary on industrialism, and the entire third act revolves around this, as Toad is captured there, and then eventually, Rat, Mole, and Badger actually get captured because they try to go to Toad Manor to keep the fort down, but then the Weasels, take over, and the Weasels have their sort of like revolution. They're like, we're gonna blow up Toad Manor because we need all the land and we hate that Toad. And, at the end of the day, they end up, Mole ends up actually saving everybody inside the factory, and they end up destroying the factory because of some stuff that I don't really want to spoil, because honestly, you guys should all go watch this film. I'm trying to be like a detailed review, but also not super spoilery, because this film is actually great. But in the end, just like in the Disney version, just like in the novel, the Weasels are defeated. Toad Hall is taken back, just under different circumstances here, where the dog food factory blows up, and yeah, they rigged the explosives. So I guess I did just spoil it. They rigged the explosives. But anyways, a large deviation in this film. I find it very interesting with the entire dog food stuff. I think it's really, really interesting, focusing on industrialism and a commentary on that. That's a very strange take. I think this probably has to tie into something in Britain. I didn't do any historical research. I probably should have, to see if there was like a deeper historical meaning at this time that people were trying to commentate on. But honestly, that message is pretty relevant still today sometimes, where we just see like corporations and factories taking over beautiful nature and supplanting themselves into these ugly looking buildings and everything. And I think it's an interesting and kind of suitable theme. I think it actually works well here, especially since the original novel tries to say this is the simple life, this is the relaxed life in nature. But anyways, going on from the actual plot of the film, let's get into some other stuff. Now, I think that this is a solid performance film. I think all the actors here, I didn't really know them, didn't know them for much, thought it was great. Thought the British comedy was very, very funny. I was laughing out loud quite a bit. I had a big smile on my face. The score is very fun. It can either be peaceful and calm or very cartoonish, and that works because it's Toad. The musical numbers, I actually enjoyed a decent bit of them.
The handsome Toad, the unstoppable Toad! The world has held its heroes, as history books have shown, but never a name to go down to fame compared with that of Toad! 50 years!
Even the ridiculous one with the rats, the weasels out in the woods, I thought that was actually kind of fun too. I thought some of the jokes, even if they were a little on the nose, were very funny. I thought that this film was just enjoyable. I loved it. It was delightful. I gave it a 4 out of 5 on Letterboxd. Here's my review. You guys can read that. But I just loved it. Just loved this film. Did not expect that I was going to love it. Thought I was going to think, this is a slug to get through. But about 15 minutes in, I was like, you know what? I actually really enjoy it. And maybe it is because of the British accents and the just quaint look of this film. Maybe it is my nostalgia for the story itself and the adaptations that I'd seen prior to this, mainly just being the Disney one and the ride. I don't know what it was, but the film worked on me. And I actually really, really enjoyed it, and have been recommending it to people. And I'm recommending it to you, audience. Now, at the end of the day, I would argue that this is actually a fairly faithful adaptation of the ride. But here's kind of the catch. We've already covered this. The ride is a faithful adaptation of the film that Disney made. The film that Disney made, although a few different plot points and scenarios, it is a pretty faithful adaptation, at least of the themes and some specific plot points of the original novel. So, I mean, how hard can you really mess this up when Disney's version is a pretty good adaptation of the novel, as well as this one being a pretty good adaptation of the novel? It's really hard to mess up here. So, for that reason and that reason alone, I would say that this is a pretty good adaptation of the ride. The Wind in the Willows, otherwise known as Mr. Toad's Wild Ride as Disney rebranded it, is a good and faithful adaptation of the ride and of the original source material of the book. So Even though the film set out to be just an adaptation of the book and the novel and not really Disney's film or ride, I think it applies to all three of those. I think that this film is phenomenal. I think this film is great. I think this is going to be one of the few films that I actually can give an overly positive review. I have very minimal problems. I didn't really spot any problems. Sure, the cinematography isn't some masterclass in cinematography, but hey, it looks pretty nice. Like, it's good, even for some of its ridiculous aspects that most people would just kind of look over and be like, eh. They worked on me. It was charming. It was fun. I liked the new additions. I didn't even think they really, like, derived the story of its natural story, you know, or the film of its natural story and what it's based on. I thought this was a very good adaptation. I cannot stop praising it and recommending it. Well, friends, I do hope that you've enjoyed this video. I know that this one seems like a much shorter script. I kind of feel like it's a shorter script and not as in-depth as some of the other films that we're going to get into. Part of that is because my time on this video, I did not space out my time in this week to make this video the best that I could, if I'm being honest. But also, there's not a whole lot to go off of when it's a pretty faithful adaptation of the book, you know, and it's not... It's pretty faithful adaptation. We didn't have to cover a whole lot of bases. I didn't have a lot of like nitty-gritty criticisms between this and the ride because it's pretty faithful to the ride. Some of the other things, though, I'm sure I'm going to have a lot more of a time diving deep into the film, probably the production and how badly they represent the rides that they're supposed to be, you know, based on and all that fun stuff. You'll see as we get further and further in the list. But I hope that you're enjoying my channel, and I hope that you enjoy this series because we're going to be doing this series all year long, probably at least one film a month, but we're going to have a blast on this. And please like, share, subscribe, because later this week, we're actually going to be covering some Disney news that you guys will not want to miss. Peace out and have a great one.